Hello. So, as you may or may not know, I live in Maryland, but my mom and I just took a trip down to the Gulf Coast of Florida not too long ago, and I brought back sand from Siesta Key. And I was very inspired to make not just beach tumblers, but also beach clocks containing the sand that I brought back from Siesta Key. I washed it, I baked it to sanitize it, and this is a brand new 10-inch mold from Amazon. The one I'm showing you now, that was my first attempt, and then this one is my second attempt, and that is a 14-inch mold. Struggling to get that one out a little bit. But I got the one you see down at the bottom because I wanted the tick marks for each of the hours in the mold. They turned out to cause a little bit of complication, but I think I finally figured out the process for them. So here we go. It came with one clock mechanism. And, when I make more of these, I just need to order separate clock mechanisms and I can keep using the same mold. So I had this in a box on a puppy pad. I ended up eventually removing the box because I needed to get my heat gun horizontal to the mold and the box was in the way. But I'm just taking some rubbing alcohol on a paper towel and cleaning out the mold, making sure there's no residue or fluff from the air. This is actually fast setting epoxy resin from CCDIY, Counterculture DIY. I found that this works better when you're using mica powder. So there it is, Siesta Key, May 2025. Because then the mica powder doesn't move as much as it is curing. And I will still use artist epoxy resin on the top to help with the preservation of the piece. So I mixed up the sand into resin. I believe this was 2 ounces of resin with, maybe 30 to 45 milliliters of sand. I believe it ended up being too much. Besides mixing the epoxy resin, which for me it's 50-50, everything else really is just eyeballing as far as how much sand to put in or how much mica or pigment to put in. It's really just done by eye. So I made sure it wasn't too thick, it wasn't too thin, it was still spreadable. So just using my popsicle stick to push it up to the edge, being cautious that air can get trapped. So once I have it pushed up to the edges, I also run the popsicle stick along the edge to try and move any potential air bubbles. The one tricky thing with this mold is that the tick marks for the hours are shallower than the sides of the mold. So what I would love to be able to do is make the whole clock, maybe minus the top coat, in the mold. But as you'll see later, the resin starts to go over top of the tick marks, and then that sort of defeats the purpose unless you want to do a ton of drilling and sanding of resin out of those tick marks down the road. So I wish they had made the mold with the tick marks a little bit higher up, but again, I figured out a way around that. So again, just smoothing out the sand and then fading it upward so that there's a gradual decline in the sand as the water comes up to it. All right, so this is a mermaid mica powder, and I'm going to mix that into, I think I had somewhere between 20 and 30 mLs of resin left over from the sand, and so I'm going to mix that directly in there. And then I have this Bora Bora mica powder that I added into about the last 10 mLs. So it's a mixture of the green and the blue, just to help with the transition of colors. I was sort of kicking myself for not having enough mixed up, or in fact I mixed up too much of the sand. But that's okay. You live and you learn. So just using my gloved hand, and it is important that you use nitrile gloves when working with epoxy resin versus just regular plastic gloves or latex gloves, and also wear your respiratory PPE. So just blended it, made some nice swirls, gave it a good torch, hit it with the heat gun just to get the colors mixed a little bit more. And I believe I also at some point will spritz it with some 91% isopropyl alcohol just to help with bubbles. And there I was just using my popsicle stick to make sure there weren't any bubbles along the edges, cleaning up the sides of the mold with a paper towel and alcohol, making sure it's nice and flat. And then I will cover it with a food net to keep the heebie-jeebies out. AKA pet hair, lint, bugs, you know, all the fun things that float around. And let that cure. All right, so here it is once it has cured, and I'm just kind of examining it. But yeah, it's set up very nicely. And here I have, looks like about 4 ounces of epoxy resin mixed up. And I'm just sectioning it off into smaller cups, one to keep clear and one for the white waves. I wasn't thrilled with the amount that was the ocean. I felt like I did have too much sand, as I sort of hinted at before, so I did go ahead and mix up another batch of the green, which is called Mermaid. And then I will eventually add more blue powder to the green and then add more of that at the top. Toward the bottom, I just added some clear. It is important when you are making waves that you have some clear resin to help push the waves. I wanted to add a little bit deeper of a blue color, so I added some sapphire alcohol ink. And just pushing that clear so that it touches the green, giving some nice swirls to the colors. And then I'll be getting ready to mix up the white for the waves. This is a white epoxy dye. I got it right off of Amazon, and it only takes a little bit. And then I'm just using my heat gun to warm up the resin, and I will take a popsicle stick and oh, here is where I realized I started to overflow the mold. Well, not the mold, but I was getting above those tick marks. So I tried to remove some of the excess resin just by scooping it up with my finger, because I did not want to do a ton of sanding toward the end if I didn't have to. So I just took my popsicle stick and put down some white strands. Once I heated the resin back up, this heat gun is on low heat, high air. So I ran that back and forth. And then the ones out in the ocean, so to speak, I knew would disappear for the most part. You can still see them a little bit, but I was totally okay with that. So now I'm coming back in and adding another wave closer to the shore, hitting with hot air first, then coming back in with low heat, high air. If you overheat the resin, it will not form cells. Oh, here's where I'm realizing I covered up the tick marks again. So just scooping some of the excess resin off. But anyway, if you overheat the white resin, it will not form cells the way that you might like it to. Another thing that really helps with cell formation is when you spritz with isopropyl alcohol. And again, I use 91%. Here's a nice close-up. You can kind of see how the resin is covering up some of those tick marks. And I'll show you later what I do with those. So cover it with a food net, as always, and let cure. So it's all cured, and I'm switching out the puppy pad for parchment paper. That's a lot of P's. And then here's the demolding process. Just some pieces for me to pick off later from the edges. And voila! I was very happy with it. But I have found in my other experiments with clocks lately that I really do prefer having at least 2 layers of waves. It really gives the clock extra dimension and really makes it even more realistic. But before I pour the next layer and make more waves, I do want to trim this up. So I'm using my X-Acto knife, and it was okay because the resin wasn't completely cured yet, but it wasn't easy either. And so I thought, okay, this is the last time I'm doing this. So before I pour the next layer, you will see what I do to help prevent resin from getting into those tick mark areas in the future. Any parts that were extra stubborn, I heated up with my heat gun to make the resin a little bit softer, and then it would cut a lot easier. Anytime you use a mold, you're going to have a sharp edge. And at this point, I was trying to use my X-Acto knife to trim the edge, but it wasn't working that well, and I didn't really trust myself to do it. Toward the end of this video, I'm going to show you what's called a deburring tool. I didn't know they exist, but I watched the Crazy Glass Lady on YouTube. I recommend her channel. She's a hoot. But she mentioned a deburring tool one time, and then I went straight to Amazon and got myself one. I'm not a master at it yet, but I will show you at the end of the video how to use a deburring tool to get the sharp edge off the edge of your piece. You can also use a sanding block, and I believe at some point I did do that. But once you do a top coat or two, of course that sharp edge ends up getting covered up anyway. All right, so it's cleaned up the best I can get it for the time being, and I cleaned it with isopropyl alcohol and a paper towel. And I have these little stands that I used in the past for canvas paintings, and I am setting the clock on the stands, but making sure that the slots the resin will be able to flow through the slots without hitting the stand, because then it will permanently adhere, and that's not what you want. So this time I didn't put anything on the back of the clock, but when I go to do the top coat, I am going to show you something different that I do. So here I kind of am learning the hard way that you really need to protect the back from drips, unless you want to do a ton of sanding later on. So I believe this is about 3 ounces of epoxy resin, 3 to 4 ounces. And my goal is to make more waves. Like I said, I do want another layer of waves. So I cover about the top 2/3, top 75% with clear. And then I have to be really careful around each of those tick marks, making sure that the resin for the most part is doming around them versus just seeping right through. The reason I don't put the clear toward the bottom at this point is because I just don't need it. That will get filled in later with the top coat. All right, so I've got the white mixed up again, hitting it with some isopropyl alcohol and the heat gun just to pop any air bubbles. And hitting it with the torch to also pop air bubbles. Do not hit it with a torch right after you spray with alcohol. Ask me how I know. And just following the same process as before. So you may not be able to tell, but I am spritzing it with isopropyl alcohol. Again, that not only helps with bubbles, but also cells in the waves. So just taking my gloved hand and running it around the edge and the bottom, trying to smooth out any drips, but I don't know, I feel like it wasn't really that fruitful because you'll see the bottom when it's done. And speaking of which, here it is once it's cured. It still did stick a little bit. That was leftover paint that was dried to my stands. But yeah, see the drips there? We will take care of those. And we will also prevent those in the future. I have a trick up my sleeve that I learned on YouTube. I didn't make it up. All right, so to try and get rid of the drips, I first heated them up with my heat gun, and then I took my craft knife. Actually, this is the little section of paint that had come off of one of the stands. That ended up coming off okay, and the majority of the drips came off okay, but it was a lot of work. This video is really sped up, and I will show you a picture in a little bit. I ended up using my power sander to sand down the rest of the drips all the way. And again, I don't ever want to have to do this again, so I will show you how I prevent it shortly. All right, so here comes the trick. That is Monster Liquid Latex. Now, it is really thick and it is also quite fumey, so I recommend wearing your respiratory PPE while using this stuff, or in a well-ventilated area. It is so thick that I guess that's a good thing because you don't want it to pour through the little cracks, but I used my finger to spread it out as thin as I could, and I used a popsicle stick to kind of get out the excess from the cracks, but it did not dry quickly. I did need to leave it overnight or even for a full day, and now it's completely dry. So what that'll do is it will help us peel up any drips of epoxy resin from the bottom, especially on the sides of those cracks. So I'm just cleaning off the top and the sides with a paper towel and isopropyl alcohol, making sure that none of the liquid latex has dried onto the sides because I do want the resin to coat the sides. And it's pretty easy to feel with your hand and remove with a knife or your hand. So here we go. This is Artist Cure Epoxy Resin. This is from Flynn Sisters. And I gave it a little spritz with alcohol just to help get the bubbles going. But my goal here is to simply give it a good quality top coat. Not that my other resin isn't quality, but this has the highest possible UV protection of which I am aware. But again, avoiding the cracks because I don't want to lose epoxy resin. So just pushing it around with my gloved finger, trying to get it to sort of dome, knowing that I will still lose some. But that's what we have the liquid latex for underneath. All right, so the epoxy has cured, and I am using my craft knife to help me get under the liquid latex. It also peels up pretty easily with your gloved hand, but let me try to zoom in. Hang on. So the drips still need encouragement to pop off. In other words, the drips are not going to just peel up easily with the liquid latex. See how I have to get my knife under there? And some of those other drips that I was picking at earlier, they were from the first round. But I will say that the drips come off nice and cleanly this time because of the layer of latex that's between the existing resin and the drips. You obviously need to be very careful while doing this. Always cut away from yourself. All right, so lots of fun peeling. Anything that you see left at this point was from the first round and will get sanded down. And again, I won't use that process again. I will use the latex. It is by far worth it. I was so happy with how this turned out. Has a nice shimmer to it. And, you know, it's not perfect, but it's handmade. All right, so here's my little power sander. So just gave it a good sand and then cleaned it off with alcohol and a paper towel. There's the clock mechanism. The middle did not fit, so I did have to I have an old nail drill, and I had to drill out just a little bit of the hole in the middle for the mechanism to fit. But once it fit, I put it all together, gave it a AA battery, and it was good to go on the wall. Now, this is going to end up in a store called Tidal Salt in Sykesville, Maryland, where I sell a lot of my items. This was the other one I made. I'm not going to show you the full process, but this mold was a 14-inch mold, and clearly it does not have those tick marks for the hours. I liked this one a lot better because I didn't have to bother with the tick marks, but I still ended up using the latex on the back for the top coat. This is me just showing you the second round of waves. But for this one, I learned a lot. This was one of the first ones I made, and this one ended up being a Father's Day gift for my dad, who is one of the reasons I love the ocean and learned to swim in the ocean and to be safe while doing so. So this was a Father's Day gift for him. The other ones are going in the store for me to sell. I will show you the deburring tool toward the end of the video, but before we get there, thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, so here's another clock I've been working on, and I'm trying to show you that sharp edge. And this is a deburring tool, B-U-R-R-I-N-G. And you just run it along the edge and it peels up that sharp edge. The softer the resin, the easier it is to do. Of course, you don't want it so soft that it'll just kind of gum up on you. But the blade does snap vertically into the handle, but horizontally the blade spins. It's not motorized or anything, but the blade will turn as you use it. It is not completely locked into place, but it is locked into the handle, if that makes sense. So I was just kind of figuring out if I should run it, toward me or away from me. I think I figured out that running it toward me was easier, but it was also scratching the surface of the clock a little bit. So I do need to get better at using this, but I really did like it, especially when it came up with like a long stringy piece that you can kind of see right there. So I don't know. I do like this as an alternative to sanding, and I'm sure plenty more practice will be in the future. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.